Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Joshua Keating of Vox Media and our esteemed panel.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for what's unfortunately a very well-timed panel. We're gathered today in a moment of crisis for the media globally. 2024, we saw a record number of journalists killed around the world, and based on the numbers collected by Jodie's organization, 2025 isn't looking much more promising. We've seen unprecedented crackdowns, campaigns of intimidation, and new restrictions on news gathering, not just in authoritarian countries, but in some countries that have traditionally been among the foremost champions of press freedom. And for media outlets, the economic environment is brutal as we struggle to stay solvent, and particularly smaller organizations. And journalists themselves, in addition to their day-to-day work, are struggling with the ever-present reductions in staffs and layoffs. And meanwhile, looming ahead is the specter of AI, which threatens to give both governments and malign actors powerful new tools to spread disinformation. And so, as I lay out this litany of threats, we all know these challenges. The question is, what are we going to do about it? So I'm hoping that our esteemed panel today can shed a little bit of light on that for us. We're joined today by Genser, who's an international human rights lawyer and managing director of Perseus Strategies. Jodie Ginsberg is the CEO of the Committee to Protect Journalists. Laura Manley is the executive director of the Shorenstein Center on Media Politics and Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. And unfortunately, Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya is caught in UN traffic and will hopefully be joining us midway through the panel. So I'm going to start with a question for the whole panel, and I'm hoping each of you can answer. What steps would you like to see now from either governments or large news outlets to sort of protect the larger ecosystem for news gathering and for healthy media? Maybe, Jared, we could start with you.
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks for having me. I think there are a lot of things that actually can be done. I think the most important thing is to try to ensure that regulatory bodies are actually independent and are able to do that. There are also lots of efforts around the world in various countries that are anti-SLAPP laws, trying to basically stop strategic litigation to stop journalists from publishing and making that much harder to make happen. I also think that we have to, a lot of the press freedom indexes that are out there, I think do really, really good work. But we also have to look at the more indirect metrics that determine press freedom that go far beyond just the number of deaths, which is horrific, that obviously take place, as well as wrongly imprisoned journalists, where I've been engaged quite a bit as well.
Jodie?
So I think the first thing to say is we need the tone to be set from the top. So part of the reason that we're seeing such a downturn in safety for journalists and for media organizations is because we've seen increasingly in supposedly democratic countries, many of those in positions of power denigrating and demeaning journalists. And that has a cascade effect where we then start to see increased litigation, spurious litigation against journalists. Record numbers of journalists were in prison worldwide last year, and they were not all in prison in authoritarian regimes. It includes places like Hong Kong, Guatemala. There's currently a journalist in detention here in the US. And then, as we were saying, to ensure that you have the regulatory environment to support it, that you have the funding to support it, and that you are tackling those who are not supporting press freedom. So you're ensuring that the impunity that exists for those who wrongfully detain journalists, who wrongfully kill journalists, cannot continue. One of the biggest problems that we have is that at least 8 out of 10 journalist murders go unpunished, and that creates an environment in which governments and others in power feel they can literally get away with murder.
Laura?
I think if we want to protect high-quality information at the end of the day, we need to widen our lens in what we understand as the media. Today, globally, 56% of news consumers get their information and understanding of the world from social media. And so if we don't start thinking about news beyond just how to protect the traditional news industry and think about all of the other places that people are going, whether that's Substack or TikTok or YouTube, which is the fastest growing platform where more people go for news than any other combination of cable and network and platforms combined, then we're really missing the point.
So Jared, you've represented, as you mentioned, journalists throughout the world who've been wrongfully imprisoned, but as you look across the global landscape, where do you see the sort of biggest declines, or what are the biggest areas of concern?
Well, I think that we have enormous challenges, I think, all around the world, and I think that's reflected in the most recent Reporters Without Borders Press Freedom Index, which they published for 2025, which shows that 6 of 10 countries in the world have seen a decline in press freedom in the last year alone. And that's at historic lows in terms of press freedom. For the first time, Reporters Without Borders described this as an incredibly serious and difficult situation in ways that they hadn't ever done before. To give you a sense of what that means, I mean, 20 out of 32 countries in Asia have seen backsliding in terms of press freedom just in the last year. And you obviously have, if you look at kind of the least free countries in the world, there are a lot of obvious suspects there. China, North Korea, Nicaragua, Belarus, and so forth. But I think that when you see larger countries that have historically been more free in terms of their press freedoms, now restricting press freedoms both through economic pressure, the imprisonment of journalists and so forth, what this means is that gives license to the smaller countries that are more off the beaten path because you can't say, well, do as we say. You have to pretty much, realize that that's not going to be a compelling argument when you see everything, or across the board, so much moving in the wrong direction.
And Jodie, to turn to you, what do you see as driving this huge increase in the number of journalists killed around the world and threats to journalists? I mean, where geographically is the biggest threat, and what's responsible for this uptick we're seeing?
Well, currently, for obvious reasons, the deadliest place in the world right now to be a journalist is Gaza. Last year, 124 journalists were killed and media workers were killed worldwide. Just under two-thirds of those were killed by Israel. Inevitably, in a war, in a genocide, that will impact the entire population, of which, of course, are journalists. But in this case, we're also seeing dozens of cases where journalists have been deliberately targeted. And as a reminder, journalists are civilians and must always be treated as such in a war setting. So we're seeing journalists deliberately targeted in war. We are also seeing journalists vulnerable across the world. And to Jared's point, this is not just happening in conflict. It's not just happening in traditional authoritarian regimes. It's happening across the world. Mexico, the most dangerous place in the world to be a journalist outside of a war zone. And the net result of that is, of course, you end up with then what are not just news deserts, but whole zones of silence where it's simply too dangerous to report on certain issues, which means the local population is not getting any of the information about what's happening inside their society, inside their communities. And that's the net result. I think that it's important to stress. It's not simply about the killing of journalists. It's about, which in itself is, a crime, in itself a violation of human rights and international humanitarian law. It's also what happens afterwards, that the result is quite often you are deliberately scaring people out of reporting on a particular issue or preventing them reporting on a particular issue. And that's why we need to be very concerned about these spikes in both the killings of journalists, but also the detentions of journalists as well.
So Laura, as somebody who works in a newsroom, when we think about AI, it's sort of two things are happening at once. We're looking at it as a potential threat to our search traffic, as something that might take our jobs someday, but also a potentially valuable tool. I'm wondering, are there ways that it can be sort of used in a more productive way rather than just being seen as a sort of threat to the profession and the industry?
Yeah, and I just want to follow up on Jodie's point right there. In the United States, if we begin to expand the lens of what we mean by journalism and understanding the news, and realize that a lot of people are getting their understanding of the world from comedians, from talk shows, from content creators. When we look at what happened with Jimmy Kimmel recently, this is another example of how it's becoming more and more difficult to express what's happening in the world, regardless of your point of view. As far as AI in the newsroom, I think there's been a lot of hype that it's going to fundamentally transform the field. And it has in lots of ways, but I don't think there's been enough conversation about the focus actually being on efficiency. It's changed the way that newsrooms can be more efficient. Instead of having to send your limited staff to a board meeting or a local town meeting and having to transcribe everything, having AI record it, transcribe it, pull out some of the key trends, and then have your limited staff actually looking at that content and evaluating it, I think that's the kind of use case we want to be talking about. I actually think the bigger change and transformation with AI is how it's changing audience behavior and how it's serving up different types of content. So I don't see it as necessarily a doom and gloom type of thing, or a wonderful opportunity that's going to make everything for journalists easier. I actually don't think we have enough data, because right now it's really hard to understand the impacts of AI because platforms are fragmented, people are going all different places. Our attention economy has really made it difficult to understand the long run of all of this work, and we need to have more data in order to understand the actual impacts of what's happening with AI.
Thank you so much. Sviatlana, I'm so glad you were able to join us. You got some good news a few months ago with the release of your husband Sergei, and I guess I'm wondering, going forward, how do you plan to continue to keep informing the world about events on the ground in Belarus and sort of keeping the global attention on the fight for democracy there?
So first of all, just we are talking about freedom of speech, and I have to say that any dictatorship starts with putting pressure on free media, first of all. I remember how in 2020, my husband was ordinary blogger, and he just, was going around Belarus, just asking ordinary people, how do you feel? What are your threats? What are your feelings? How do you feel about Belarus? And because of this, he was jailed. It already then it showed that regime will not be allowed people to speak free. And in 2020, during our uprising, the first category of people who were attacked, these were journalists, because regime didn't want the world to see, pictures from Belarus, to see these beautiful rallies, that show the desire of Belarusian people for changes. And since 2020, my husband was in jail. He was kept in solitary confinement all these 5 years, and now he is in freedom. I'm really grateful to diplomatic efforts of President Trump for release of several groups of people, encouraged to continue this humanitarian track, because we still have 1,300 political prisoners, among which a lot of journalists. Of course, if you are a journalist, in Seoul, you have to continue this work and open the truth, to the people around the world. And now my husband, after release, though being very exhausted physically, he wasn't broken, and he immediately jumped into our fight. He restarted to have his blog. Now he is traveling in the USA. He's visiting diaspora. He's working with State Department just to increase attention to Belarusian topic. So he's promoting, of course, freedom of media, because it's essential to counter propaganda, to keep many topics high on the agenda. In our case, is Belarus. So without free media, society starts to be suppressed, for sure.
Thank you. Jared, so when we talk about government crackdowns on press or the targeting of journalists, people tend to think of arrests or even the killing of journalists, but often forms of pressure are a little subtler. We're talking about lawsuits or just sort of restrictions, making people sign agreements when they're covering certain government agencies. What are the sort of unique legal challenges with dealing with sort of forms of pressure like that?
Yeah, let me just use one country as a case study, Pakistan, a country that I've come to know quite well because I serve as international counsel to Imran Khan, the former prime minister, who's in prison there. And the crackdown on the free media has been central to what the regime has done after imprisoning Imran Khan and many of his supporters. Right? It began with the press authority banning the use of his name by any journalist in the country. Couldn't mention his name, couldn't talk about his political party. From there, it went to detaining dozens of journalists. Many journalists fled out of fear that they're not going to have the opportunity to even stay out of prison. And at this point, from there, as if that wasn't enough, then the government has now gone after journalists, even those that are abroad, by getting YouTube channels shut down. Some of the most popular Pakistani journalists are now in exile and still reporting. And with bogus court orders that are obtained through the legal system, YouTube has taken down websites of streams of the most popular Pakistani journalists. So I mean, it is really systematic and being driven from the top down. And the tragedy is, Pakistan these days, which I guess in some respects is a better than a worse thing, not Ukraine or Gaza. But nonetheless, when you're talking about a country of a couple 100 million people, right, and you see the media being shut down in such a widespread, systematic, and comprehensive manner, with no response really from the international community, it gives you a sense of the enormous challenges, because you need countries around the world to be confronting countries like Pakistan, and that unfortunately is just not happening. So I think it's these are enormous challenges, and you have to think of alternate channels, exactly as was just being discussed, to get news out, to reach the people. Ironically, as is often the case with many of the clients I've represented, the more suppressed political leaders are, or journalists are, the more popular their work becomes. And so I do think that there's been an upsurge in interest in Pakistan from the average Pakistani, and bypassing blocks on media and the internet at times as well to access that information. But changing fundamentally the situation on the ground remains an enormous challenge.
So, Jodie, we've heard Jimmy Kimmel's name mentioned already. He's back on the air tonight, but it's not clear how many people are actually going to get to see it. And when President Trump says things like, when 97% of the stories are bad about one person, that's no longer free speech. I'm curious, looking in your international work, when you're hearing that kind of message from the U.S. administration and the kind of hostility to journalists we've heard, what kind of impact globally does that have?
It has a huge impact globally, and let me say, I think this point about the media being the first to be targeted when you start to see democracies crumble is really, really important, because it is a leading indicator. All of the research shows that. And so when you start to see that happening in somewhere like the United States, you really need to pay attention, because it never stops there. It is always the first vector of attack. But what happens when you have the leader of the United States, which has for long set itself up as a defender of the free press, say that, it emboldens those who would want to be able to shut down the press elsewhere. In the first Trump administration, we saw repeatedly countries like Brazil, for example, and others repeat almost word for word the language being used against journalists by Donald Trump. But it's more than that. It's also the way in which the US has, for many years, supported independent media across the world in places where independent media would otherwise not exist at all. And of course, with the swinging USAID cuts, the cuts to DRL funding, we've seen almost all of those independent media in many parts of the world crumble. On top of which you have the gutting of Voice of America, the gutting of Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia. So suddenly, it's not just how the administration is talking about the media, it's literally ripping out the funding that has enabled so much independent reporting by individuals who are in repressive regimes about those repressive regimes. And it's not an exaggeration to say that when you pull that, you obviously put those journalists in much greater danger, but you're removing a source of independent information that's been vital for both US national security, but also for informing the populations in repressed regimes.
Laura, are there any sort of new models of disseminating the news, or people who are doing exciting work outside the traditional, newspapers, TV stations, or traditional forms of media that really excite you, that think that could be, blueprints for others going forward?
Well, I think It's interesting you use the word blueprint because in some ways, yes, we do want to look for best practices and great models. And actually, one of the people here, V Sphere from Under the Desk News, is a great example of someone that is really evidence-based, rigorous, and trying to put forward the news in a neutral, objective way. And they're on TikTok and across all of the different platforms. But I think the value of independent media in the content creation space is that there isn't a definitive blueprint. It doesn't have to be one specific way in order to get through. And V and a number of creators talk about authenticity and how to build trust with audiences and make it feel and actually be really connecting with your audience instead of saying, this is the agenda, this is what I'm telling you, and eat your broccoli and deal with it. Now you can have a more nuanced understanding of what's happening, and you can select into the types of people that represent your experience and have a better understanding. That said, there's challenges to that, right? Because people can go and look for it wherever to confirm their bias. So I think having a nuanced understanding and the public being aware that not all information is created equal, and we need to be thoughtful in our information consumption.
Sviatlana, you've talked about the sort of ongoing work you and your colleagues are doing in Belarus, but what do you think are steps that either foreign governments or large news organizations could take to support the journalists who are trying to report on the ground in countries like Belarus that were very restrictive media environments?
So first of all, I want to say a couple of words about media in exile, because Belarus case is when you absolutely don't have possibility to broadcast from Belarus at all. And those media who have been ruined, liquidated, suppressed in Belarus in 2020, they managed to renew their broadcasting from abroad. It's extremely difficult. Regime declared all this media as extremists or terrorists. Nobody want to order advertisements in your media because you are terrorists. So it's very difficult to survive. So we always asking democratic countries to support free media in exile, because it's crucially important to counter propaganda that are in Belarus, who own TV, who own all the platforms, and God bless internet. Of course, we can use media, different platforms like YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, anything just to deliver the honest news to Belarusian people. And about 60–70% of the consumers of free media in exile, in the case of Belarus, are from inside the country. Though even if you are reading honest news that are extremistic, you can be detained for years and years in jail. But people are looking for this information because they need, to read what is happening in reality. And it's very important to give this free media in exile possibility to survive. So I would ask the democratic countries maybe to launch emergency fund for independent media, not just give a very short grant, but to have consistent support for free media, not stop for a day. Because if any small or big media stop broadcasting for 1–2 days, they disappear from media space, and we cannot afford this.
So I think I have time for one more question, which I'll put to all of you, if you could try to keep your answers succinct. But as much as I'd love to hear more about what journalists and news organizations can do to navigate this moment, what would you say to consumers of news? What do you think is the best way to be a kind of responsible news reader or news viewer in an era when we're facing these challenges? I can start with you, Jared.
Yeah, I mean, it becomes more difficult, especially as Sviatlana was saying, with the cuts in funding, right? I mean, I work in a country like Cambodia, for example, where Radio Free Asia, their Facebook page has about 8 million followers in a country of 14 million people, right? And the withdrawal of funding from Radio Free Asia, for example, just has a dramatic impact. And if you were to ask the average Cambodian, how do you consume news? They were getting all of their news from Radio Free Asia, most especially. And so for an average person in the room, who obviously is getting around the world to some extent, I think it's easier. I think that there are still huge divides that can't be broached, and we need to be able to talk to each other more. But I am most worried about authoritarian and semi-authoritarian regimes where the options are just so few that cutting off of one major, actually independent news organization can decimate the ability of the people in the country to understand what's really happening.
Jodie.
I'm most excited by the burgeoning of local media and the resurgence of local media. So I would say support your local media provider.
Plus one to that. So I think focusing on the local issues that matter and connecting with people in person, crazy idea, but like in person, talking to folks, connecting with your community, that's one of the best ways to counter authoritarianism and this, crushing feeling that we have in our media ecosystem. The one thing I just really want to stipulate, oftentimes when people ask this, they go towards media literacy and saying, you need to do your homework and to understand the news better. My mom in rural Massachusetts is no match for the algorithms of Meta. It's just never. I study this and I still find myself scrolling and I'm like, why is it 1 o'clock and I'm sucked into my phone? So I don't think it's enough to just tell people to be better at reading the news. It's not fair. We also need to be thinking about accountability from the platforms, and we need our regulators to really step up because there needs to be more transparency in our information.
Sviatlana, I'll let you have the last word.
Yeah, just I want to agree that today media and different IT companies, they sometimes are even more responsible for changes, for freedoms than politicians, or societies. But of course, we need responsible media editors, but also we need responsible consumers of this information. What we're advising to Belarusians inside Belarus who are really poisoned, by propaganda, that you have to double check, the information, not just, as in post-Soviet Union countries mostly. They told this on TV, it means the truth. No, you have to check, maybe, to listen to other opinion, but it is you who have to do this. Nobody will come and, just say this is true, that knows it is you. There are no easy answers to difficult questions. Just from this point of view, look on the media and on the news.
Thanks so much. I'd love to thank Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya, Laura Manley, Jodie Ginsberg, Jared Genser. Thanks so much to all of you. Take care.